Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming out on a beautiful day for our Democratic governors panel. We did the Republicans last week. I want to thank Bonnie and Tom McCloskey. It's part of the McCloskey Speakers Series. It's great to have you here. I give a shout out to Secretary Albright, who seems to be signing autographs. No, not really, not really. Giving a phone number to one of the governors, and Kathy. Thank you all for being here. I'm going to do what I did last week, for those of you who were here, and ask a few questions sequentially so you get to know each of the governors on the panel. You know already Jay Nixon and, of course, Governor Hickenlooper, who have been here often. Governor Hickenlooper, we should thank you. You're our host, and you've hosted these governors. Thank you.
Thank you for having us. We appreciate being here.
Yeah. But I'm going to start, if I may, with Governor Bullock. And one of the things you did, both when you were Attorney General and now you're the governor of Montana, has been fighting the influx of money into politics. I think you even filed a suit against Citizens United based on a provision of your own state constitution that was a corruption, wasn't it? Why don't you explain that to me and tell me what you think we can do about money in politics, how bad it's gotten, and what legally we can do now?
You bet. And I mean, in some ways, my experience in this, I was Attorney General before I was governor-elect in 2012. But if you went back about a century, around the turn of the 19th century in Montana, a guy named William Clark, you might have heard of Clark County, Nevada, he basically owned the state. Truly, as an example, deciding where our state capital would be we had 52,000 voters. In today's dollars, about $70 million was spent, to make that decision. Bought a Senate seat, went back to D.C. They were trying to decide to put him, whether he'd be in the Senate. And he said, and this was in like 1900, he said, there's so much money in this system that people no longer even vote. I literally have to take men out to drag them to get to the polls. Yes, fast forward, Citizens United comes. I was Attorney General. I wrote the brief. The 26 other states signed on to, Democrats and Republicans, saying at the end of the day, most elections happen at the state level. And it doesn't take a copper king to buy a county commissioner. They didn't take our advice ultimately, and then we had a 100-year law following the copper kings. In 1906, a newspaper said the greatest living issue facing us today is whether the people shall control the corporations or the corporations shall control the people. We took our essentially government back, made no corporate expenditures, had a 100-year law that until Citizens United served Montana so well, how elections were decided by how many people you talked to, how many doors you knocked, not how much money you raised. Challenged, I argued it, took it up to the U.S. Supreme Court. And on a 5-4 decision, this was 2 years after Citizens United, 100 years of a real clean campaigns in Montana was wiped off the books on a 5-4 decision. Notwithstanding the fact that dissent said, even the experience since the Citizens United decision, really we should revisit whether or not independent expenditures, so-called independent expenditures, corrupts the system. Fast forward, from 2004 to 2012, you went from sort of outside dark money dollars, 80-time increase. 2014.
I'm sorry, in Montana itself?
No, so this is nationally. Or you even go to the 2014 elections, and what do we have? We have $1 billion now of outside spending on a non-presidential election, about 80% outside dollars spent on the Republican side, not even knowing who the donors were. On the Democratic side, about 25%.
Give me an example in Montana, very concrete, of what somebody trying to buy something that you feel the money getting into politics adds to corruption.
Well, that's how ultimately, look at your super PAC reporting as of yesterday. 67 people made contributions 3 times greater than 508,000, on the lower side. So the threat of spending, the actual threat of spending, independent and so-called independent, can corrupt the system because it can make public policy thinkers think differently. Now, what we can do still after the Citizens United decision, in Montana, my legislature is almost 2/3 Republican, but we passed one of the best transparency bills in the nation. Citizens United, whether you agree with it or disagree with it, it's premised on at the end of the day, let you as the consumers know who's trying to influence the elections. Let you know ultimately who's next. But what we do now have a system, even since Post-Citizens United, is nobody knows who's spending all this money because they do it through 501c4s and others. So the premise in Montana is pretty simple. If you want to spend money and influence the elections, just tell us where the check comes from. And I think that is, in a Post-Citizens United...
But does that work?
Well...
Or is that going to minimize the influence of the corruption of money in politics?
Well, if nothing else, if you can't, I mean, we could get into big discussion whether corporations have First Amendment, rights of speech and
Do
things.
they?
The U.S. Supreme Court has said yes. I was on the other side of that case.
Okay.
But I think at a minimum, adding sunshine to any system can only help it. So to add sunshine that ultimately if $1 million, $6 million is spent against one of these candidates, the consumer, the voter, ought to at least know who's writing that check, who has that interest in that.
Okay, one other question for you before we move on.
You can ask any question.
Different topic, though. It was interesting last week with the Republican governors, a couple, including I think Kasich, had expanded Medicaid coverage under the Affordable Care Act, whereas most of the Republican governors consider that at best a deal with the devil. You were able to expand Medicaid coverage under the ACA and do it by getting a Republican legislature to pass it. What type of compromises did you have to make, and how do you feel that's a template for maybe what could happen on a federal level?
Yeah, and I could say Medicaid, I could say our campaign disclosure laws, I could say an incredible water compact with Native
and
American
both
tribes.
houses are Republican, you're a Democrat.
Yeah, almost two-thirds. I'd say probably 3 points, one of them that I learned here. So I enter into it, I was part of the Rodell Fellowship.
So I should have
Leadership,
touted
yeah,
that.
leadership from the balcony, trying to look a little bit above and say what are our interests, not just be, all excited about locking heads.
Mm-hmm.
Number two would be it had been 40 years in Montana since I have young kids, and the kids this age have been part of it. My opening State of the State was we need to start acting like our kids are watching, and they probably are. And that actually starts making a different framework. Number three is that I think the average Montanan or the average Connecticut nutmegger or whatever it is, I mean, at the end of the day, what do they want? They want a safe community. They want good schools. They want a good job, and they truly want to believe that for their kids or their grandkids, things are going to get better off. If we can focus our elected officials and leaders and say, let's actually focus on what they want, not just the disputes between us, we get a lot further. And then fourth, yeah, with a legislature that's almost two-thirds Republican, I do have to compromise. The Medicaid bill that I passed wasn't everything that I would want exactly if I was the ruler of the world or had huge majorities. And I said, let's figure out the way that we can all walk out of this and be real happy with it. Now, don't kid yourself. First legislative session, I had 73 vetoes. Second legislative session, 53. Most vetoes ever in the history of Montana. So it's not that I'm going to roll over, but where we can actually focus on what we need to be doing for our communities and set some of the politics and the political battles that get people so frustrated about Washington, D.C. aside, I think that's how we can move forward.
Thank you. And let me give a special advertisement to the Rodell program for those of you who don't know. The past week, you've probably seen, if you've been around here, an enormous number of our young leaders, global leaders from around the world, whether it's our Central America leaders, our Middle East leaders, or our Henry Crown program. One of those programs that Bill Buttinger and his family started was called the Rodell program. It's for young elected officials, usually 12 Democrats and 12 Republicans each year, who become part of this Global Leaders Network and spend 2 years hopefully learning leadership based on values. So thanks for letting me give that shout out. Governor Malloy, you talk about doing things, getting things through the legislature. You were able to convince your legislature to do an infrastructure program, something the federal government hasn't been able to pull off yet. Tell us how you were able to do that And why is it hard to get the federal government to go along with you when I think 90% of the people in this country would say our roads, our airports, our rails are probably worth investing in? Keep talking, they'll figure
Got
it
it? It's a complicated answer. Let me take the second part first. I think that we have a problem in politics. And on the Republican side, one of the problems is that this is a party that's fond of throwing out its members. And you never know what issue that you might vote on today is going to be used to throw you out of the party 2 elections from now. And so we have a whole bunch of folks who are dragged further and further to the right, and in some cases to places that you or I would not have imagined they would go. The current governor of Louisiana, one of the architects of Common Core, runs away from it for fear that he's going to be thrown out of the party. So I think that's a gigantic problem. And although I think if you get most Republican leaders in a room and say, hey, shouldn't we be investing in our infrastructure at least as much as the Europeans, at least as much as, or maybe as much as the Chinese on an ongoing basis. Privately, they'll say, yeah, our highways are a mess, our bridges are a mess, our train system's a mess, our airports meet no international standard.
The cost of borrowing money is approximately zero, so why not do it now?
Right. So I think it's complicated. I think that there are folks who are making life in the Republican Party a lot more complicated than it used to be. And then you put on top of that is everybody and their brother thinks they're going to run for president someday, so they also have to be concerned about how they're going to be judged as well. So that's number one. Number two, I raised an issue. I got reelected. I wasn't supposed to be. My mother would say, "See, Dan, you fooled another one." And within 48 hours of winning that election, I made 2 decisions. I was going to move a Second Chance Society agenda, the likes of which no Democrat had attempted to move. And I was going to move a transportation infrastructure investment program that no one in my state had ever tried to move. And I think you'd have to go back to, actually somebody made a reference to Robert Moses on that scale. So we came up ultimately with a program for $100 billion. Connecticut's, 3.5 million people, and it's a pretty small geography. $100 billion to be spent over the next 30 years, which means you pay it over 50 years, because the last bond you sell, you pay for 20 years. We made more progress on that than I ever thought we would. In fact, by the end of the session, the legislature had dedicated 1/2 cent of the current sales tax to fund transportation, had agreed to put it in a lockbox. I need to get that in the constitution of the state, but legislatively they've done it. And I think the answer to it is pretty. Once we can cut through the politics that you fear it's going to be held against you, Americans get that their infrastructure is in terrible trouble. If you live near a port, the port is silting up. If you live near a major metropolitan area, you know that traffic has gone from being tied up 2 hours in the morning and 2 hours in the afternoon to 12 hours a day. They get it.
But how do you widen I-95 if the feds won't be in on this?
Well, I think that the Fed problem is a big one. You and I touched on this briefly in your office before coming over. It is a possibility that things will swing the other way. But if they don't, I can't sit here as the governor of the state of Connecticut and say, I'm going to allow my state to fall off the end of the earth because they couldn't get a job done in Washington. Somebody's got to fill the void. And so what we're saying is, hey, for our assumptions, we're going to assume that the federal money remains relatively constant. Now that could be an assumption that may be out on the far end, but let's assume that. How much more do we need to spend to have a first-in-class transportation system as opposed to a worst-in-class transportation system? Citizens get it. Electeds eventually got it because the citizens got it before they did, and we actually moved the agenda along a lot faster than I thought could be done.
Actually, when we were in my office, we were having one of those great Aspen philosophical discussions comparing Teddy Roosevelt to Franklin Roosevelt and dealing with the question of whether the Democratic Party seems to be, as I think David Brooks mentioned in his column yesterday, shifting from a traditional liberalism which helped the underclass to one that challenges the assumptions of capitalism. Are you worried about your party drifting too far to the left with the Bernie Sanders surge?
I think that the Bernie Sanders surge is something that has to be understood in the context in which it's happening. The election is not fully engaged in on our side of the equation to the extent it is on the Republican side. And I think Bernie is a bright guy and has a lot of interesting things to say, and there's a percentage I agree with. But I think what I said to you, and I had a time to catch up on the column. I think what was viewed as revolutionary in the past. So we talked about Teddy Roosevelt, a revolutionary. We talked Social Security. We talked about Franklin Roosevelt, revolutionary. Jump forward and you look at what historians were saying about Franklin Roosevelt in the 70s and 80s, and it was that he was the guy who preserved capitalism. Nobody said that when he was president. He was, a wild-eyed, crazy man who was trying to spend your money in terrible ways, and the world was going to be worse for him having graced it. My point is what was once seen as revolutionary becomes eventually to be looked at evolutionary, and therefore the importance of the moment that something happened gets lost in our writing of history, at least for the first 125 years.
And finally, one thing that we really have seen some consensus growing in a bipartisan way is what you call a second chance society, criminal justice reform. Explain that.
Well, I've said this for a long time. We are a nation of people. If your people weren't brought here in slavery, or you're not a Native American, everybody else in this audience, their people came for a second chance. We go to church on Sundays for a second chance. I mean, let's be honest, right? That's why we show up. We created bankruptcy laws because we didn't think it made a whole lot of sense to put people in prison for, overspending. But I think in the 60s as a result of riots, and then subsequently as a result of narcotics and degradation in our cities, we became more invested in permanent punishment than we were permanent reformation. And we have to reset that clock. You cannot bring, I have three poor cities, Hartford, New Haven, and Bridgeport, three poor cities, where a significant portion of the population, 10, 15%, maybe more in one of those cases, the adults can't get a job, can't get housing, can't even qualify for a student loan because of something they did at some point in their past, and frequently it was for a nonviolent offense. In fact, as I sit here today in Connecticut, we have somewhere between 500 and 600 people in our corrections department at a cost of $120 a night for mere possession of narcotics, most often caused by self-medication. Let's be honest, because we're not doing as great a job on mental health as we could and should otherwise be doing. So what I'm trying to do is reset that clock and say people have got to be given a chance to clean it up. They've got to be forgiven. We've got to, if we go to church on Sunday because we're looking for a second chance, how can we possibly deny that to someone else? And so we passed a very far-reaching step towards second chance, and I'm not done. I mean, I think we have to think about how we treat 18-year-olds and 19-year-olds and 20-year-olds in the criminal justice system, because we all know that the mind is not fully developed. That's why we don't sell liquor to that group of people. I think there are serious questions about resetting the clock and being more engaged and more supportive of permanent reformation.
Thank you. Governor Jay Nixon. Speaking of church, next Sunday, it'll be the anniversary of Ferguson. What did you learn?
A lot. First of all, basically, the three lanes that we're talking about and thinking about this is we've listened, we've learned, and things are going to get better. On the listen side, one of the heartening parts of all this was while the language was perhaps a bit rough and the actions were strong, a whole new generation of people felt like they had a voice. It was in the street sometimes, it was very loud, and that was good. That's good. I mean, to have young folks involved again, especially if they're protesting you, is some level of interest. We've learned that these are difficult issues and that there are no short-term solutions. And so we've taken over the last year a very long-term as well as short-term approach. For example, in St. Louis County, where this happened, you have far too many municipalities, and they had courts that were basically debtors' prisons, used to extract revenue for those small jurisdictions as opposed to have cops be cops instead of revenue agents. We completely and fundamentally, in the most sweeping bill ever passed in our legislature with municipal courts, have dramatically changed that, and will no longer have debtors' prisons and all of this sort of stuff vis-a-vis the municipal courts. We're going to require the police departments to be certified. Only 14 of the 62 police departments in St. Louis County have any form of certification. We're redoing.
What about Ferguson Police Department?
Not so certified. As far as that, they'll have a new chief that's starting. A lot of significant challenges there, kind of overrun, really, in the sense of relatively small town to have that much attention, and it requires.
But why can't you now put Ferguson into the municipal St. Louis Police Department and make one police department well-trained?
I think we will eventually get to that. I think the requirement of certification, when only a small percentage of them are, and the cost to get certified, will give the choice that many of those other small jurisdictions have taken, which is to go into the CLIA-certified St. Louis County Police Department. I think that's what that incremental step will clearly lead to. So we'll have a much more professional. And then next week I'll be announcing a new, what called our post-commission police officer standard and training, a broad new group of folks willing to serve on that to come in and make sure we're redoing the use of force issues and things of that nature. So those are some mechanical things that are very important structurally that are happening.
Are you going to require them to wear body cameras?
If we can afford it, and CNN wants to use the tape, I guess. If cities want to have body cameras, if we want to have them, if they want to pass a bill, I'll sign it and all that sort of stuff. But taking a picture of something bad happening is not a discussion about how to have that not happen.
Why not?
These are longer-term solutions, longer-term issues.
You don't think that the videos that have come out in the past 2 years have led to a change in police behavior?
And I don't have the exact, I'd be careful because you're rumored to be a recovering journalist, but.
I just read the stories on
the point
52 videos.
The point I was going to make on the other side is that where jurisdictions have had body cameras, the prosecution rate and conviction rates have gone up dramatically, as they have when they have. And as well as when folks wanted DNA tested. They thought it was for defense rights. It has gotten more prosecutions, successful prosecutions, than anything else. So the bottom line
does that make it good or bad?
Well, I mean, I think it's if they want to do it, fine. But I mean, I believe if you tell a cop that you are taping what he's saying, they do a pretty good job writing the reports too. I mean, they know how to do that, okay? So, and it's good to have an oversight on it, but these days everybody's got a camera. All this stuff's on TV, whether people have a body camera on or not. I mean, the biggest change we've seen over the last few years is everyone is a public figure and everyone is a reporter. And believe me, if we didn't learn anything in Ferguson, we certainly learned that, okay? Anything said by anybody anywhere, and sometimes that diminishes the ability to talk. So I'm not against body cameras, but I don't see that as solving the problem. I do think it would increase conviction rates. I do think that cops would get very good at using them to prove cases, and that may be useful to all of us, but make no mistake, it's not going to free as many people as it's going to lock up. No way. No way. The third part about the longer-term solutions, exceptionally important. For St. Louis, which has been a racially divided area for years, north and south, and the challenges we've always had in the heartland and on some of these issues, kind of suppressed discussions sometimes. This last year has been one of the most amazing years of my life. To actually shut my dang mouth and listen a little bit, it's been, oxygen's easier to get, but it also very interesting. People that wouldn't speak up before were speaking up, and at a basic level, folks are talking about these issues. And for example, we had an issue about some underperforming schools that we just couldn't get solved. The legislature passed 2 bills I had to veto that didn't solve it correctly. So instead of trying to solve it by a legislature, I went to a group of leading superintendents, and we've now adopted those schools. We have teacher mentors doing all of that. We've done a whole bunch of things, and when school starts this year, those 2 schools, I'm here to tell you, over the next few years will dramatically improve because the best educators in my state are going to give up their time after their day jobs or during other times to make sure those schools improve. That wouldn't have happened if there hadn't been the intensity we saw last year. And then the last piece I want to say, because I just get to say it once here, like I say, I'm 19 months before the end of my term. I'll get my full First Amendment rights back then. But I want to say that the law enforcement folks at Ferguson, after the initial challenges, as well as the National Guardsmen, the citizen soldiers that were necessary there because of a myriad of threats, a myriad of very, very challenging moments. Our pillars during that time were speech and safety. And I don't think anyone will doubt there wasn't enough speech. Plenty of speech. Safety, I'm like the world's expert on riots now. As you prepare for this sort of stuff, you get briefed by everybody about every riot that's ever occurred anywhere. And as folks look back, we in Missouri want this to be something that was difficult, was painful, was not fun, but good came from it, better came from it. And as far as that, those folks that were there on the front line, since August 9th of last year until we completed all of the legal stuff that had to go through, not a single shot was fired by a police officer or a National Guardsman that struck a citizen on American soil involved in that, nor were any of those officers shot. That is a standard far above Rodney King, where 53 people were killed in those riots, including 12 shot by the cops. And so the folks on the first front line, those police officers and other folks that had to be out there during extremely difficult times with unbelievable things being thrown at them and said to them, they showed a discipline that may not have been pretty, but was successful in getting us through this without other bodies laying on the ground, and us in a situation now as 1 year later and the Ferguson Commission begins to do the 100 points of action we're working on, where things are going to get better. And Missouri is going to lead. We're not backing away from our challenge here. We're not, just because the TV cameras left and because it's not on the front page of every paper, saying it's not a challenge. And I'm very proud of my state for not being scared on the most difficult issues we have in this country: cops, police, kids, race, education, poverty, health care. It would have been really very easy to back up and step away and let them go to New York and talk about Gardner or Baltimore or Charleston. And instead, we've engaged. And to that, as somebody who's been involved in public process, it's been one of the most heartening years of my life, even though very difficult.
Yeah. Governor, thank you. Governor, I think we first met in the 1990s when I was at Time Magazine. I used to take the other editors down the Mississippi River to stop at each town and learn things. And you were the Attorney General, right? State Attorney General of Missouri. And you were there at the reform of certain types of laws, how Missouri was going to change things. You talk about the Ferguson Commission and the 100-some-odd points. Just give us 1 or 2 examples now, having spent 25 years as, from Attorney General, Governor, whatever, of what you would change in terms of race and policing.
That's a very good question.
I mean, you know, we did the St. Louis dialogue, the
right.
Aspen Institute, and I was reading some of the Ferguson Commission proposals.
When I was elected to the state senate in 1986, in order to be a police officer, standard, trained, licensed police officer, required 120 hours of training. To be a cosmetologist took 1,500 hours. Now, I've seen a lot of bad haircuts in my day. But no matter how bad they are, they don't lock you up and take away your liberty. So we now have a much more professional law enforcement than we have. We've passed training and requirements. We have the post commission I talked about. We invented it so that we try to hold those standards and things like that. So in law enforcement, you've had that. On the issues involving race and education is where they have really intersected. We have the 2 largest desegregation cases in the history of America in St. Louis and Kansas City, which is Attorney General. We brought to a conclusion and opened schools up and desegregated communities in ways that were stunning. I stood in a courtroom and apologized that the Missouri Constitution still had a separate but equal provision in it into the 1970s. 1970s. We had a war in the century before that. So some of the changes we've been able to make in those areas are exceptionally important. Exceptionally important. And the other thing, in my state, and even, the air's cleaner, the water's cleaner, people are healthier. So, I mean, when you look at other issues where we've made a difference, those are areas. Whatever else you want to ask about, I'm fine.
Thank you very much. Governor, first let me start with the question everybody's asking, which is, where'd you get that ugly tie, and what is it?
So, and I think this tie is part of a reflection also of the fact that these guys were wearing their coats. Actually, Governor Malloy is now backed off. But Walter told me if I was going to wear this tie out, I had to take my coat off. I'm not quite sure of the arithmetic for that. Today is, and I'm sure most of you out there know this, today is Colorado Day. Yay! So 139 years ago today, Colorado became a state. So this is in honor of Colorado Day.
Okay. Yeah. So, Governor, unlike many people in your types of positions, you're mainly a businessman. You were a geologist, I think, and then ran a brewing company and other things. What do you think about the role of business, how that's helped inform you as a governor, and whether the Democratic Party has somehow lost touch to some extent with the role of business?
Well, I think that, and I ran for mayor in 2003. It was the first time I ever ran for anything in my whole life. I still have second doubts, questions about that decision. But it was because, as a business person, I was frustrated by the lack of common sense. There was a city council initiative to raise parking rates when we were going into a difficult recession. And every downtown business person came in and talked to the city council and the mayor and said, when things are getting worse, don't raise the cost of doing business. And it was as if we were speaking Greek, ancient Greek, not the modern day. Well, actually, maybe I should say the modern day
Modern
Greek.
Greece, yeah.
So, but anyway, and I think that there is a tremendous opportunity to bring some of the common sense, especially from small business, but the management expertise from large business into the enterprise of local government and state government. There's a guy in Denver named Jeff Smart. He wrote a book called Who, about how to hire people. And he really has helped us in a number of different states around the country look at how do you, in a much more professional way, how do you hire people. I just finished the chairs initiative for the National Governors Association. I had 3 big focuses. One was hiring people, and how do you get more people from the private sector to kind of bring and cross-pollinate that logic. One was how do you use lean principles and basic business strategies to have continuous improvement, right? And to tell our citizens that your time matters. How long you're waiting in line to get your driver's license, that is important, and it's got to matter. And then the third one was we looked at how's the appropriate way to make regulation. And it's not regulators. We're trying to convince all of our regulators now in the state that we're not going to call them regulators. They're going to be facilitators. And they obviously have to protect the public good, make sure that clean air, clean water remain highest priorities. But at the same time, they're to facilitate and get the friction out of business. And so we did that for the National Governors Association, and the response was remarkable. In other words, I think there's a real appetite for, again, government's different than business, but a lot of the experience and common sense of business can find a nurturing home in government.
How does that translate into the way you've tried to handle the fracking issue?
Well, certainly in all the oil and gas relationships with the state government over the last 4 or 5 years, and again, natural gas is a powerful transitional fuel to get us to a clean economy, right? If you're trying to get more wind energy, natural gas cycles on and off when wind is intermittent and fills in those voids much more effectively than coal ever can. But we have to make sure we get it safely. Well, there's a big movement that fracking was, absolutely unsafe, should never be done. I know I'm going to irritate maybe more than irritate some people here. I mean, science, if we get back to fact-based decisions, fracking can be done safely. It's an industrial process, and it's got to have, I think, some significant regulation. When we sat down to create those regulations, we made sure that we had some of the toughest environmental groups, the Environmental Defense Fund, they provided experts, but we also had the experts from the industry, and from the beginning, we had them in the room together. So that what came out of that was, and my guarantee to the industry was, no red tape. We're not going to have additional bureaucracy. Every dollar that you spend in additional, to do the methane regulations, every additional dollar will actually make our air cleaner. Second is we're going to make sure that in the end, you get credit for this. And oftentimes the industry feels that anytime that there is a higher level of regulation that's more costly, they spend the money and then their adversaries get all the credit. I think that process of having everybody in the same rule, making sure everyone gets credit, make sure there's not red tape. We ended up spending $80 million. The oil and gas industry is going to spend $80 million a year making sure the air of Colorado is cleaner. But already we see we've been doing this for a year and a half now, industry and the small businesses that provide services are finding less expensive ways to capture that methane and make sure it is turned in. It's not just contributing to greenhouse gases, it's actually helping us reduce our carbon emissions. I mean, that's the way regulation should work.
And does that mindset help? Is that what's helped you turn Colorado into a high-tech hub?
Well, the high-tech, that part of it is Colorado's always had here I am. This is the choir. You guys can all give me a high C. Because it's about quality of life. And so back when I was mayor, and especially since I've been governor, we've really promoted the arts. Tried to make sure that the rock and roll bands that made their homes in Colorado or came back, that we celebrated them. With Red Rocks. How many of you have ever been to Red Rocks? Right. Red Rocks used to do 30 shows a year. Now it does 110 shows a year. To make sure
that attracts high-tech entrepreneurs.
It does. Well, the people that are the high-tech entrepreneurs want to hang around artists and musicians. This is the old Richard Florida feeling that those kind of nerdy guys, I don't want to look at any of my friends here, but we were all maybe a little nerdy in school. That kind of affinity for creative energy does attract the creative folks. And we now, Denver has more live music venues than Nashville or Austin.
Wow.
And we don't talk about it, but that's a fact.
Well, no, it is. No, it's an interesting point that the creative economy and creative class has been the greatest magnet, whether it's in Austin, Texas, or my hometown, New Orleans, for a tech and entrepreneurial class.
Well, and they want, Metro Denver has become a great magnet. Forbes magazine came out last Wednesday, and they ranked the top of the 300 largest metropolitan areas. They said, what are the best places for business and career, the most pro-business places. And so of the top 40 metropolitan areas, 5 of them were in Colorado. Fort Collins was 10th, and Denver was 1st. Wow. And a lot of that is because it is. A lot of that is because this youthful migration of millennials coming in. Denver started making investments. Back in the mid-'80s, there's a regional, the only metropolitan area in the country where there's a regional tax for the cultural institutions. So the Museum of Nature and Science has more paid memberships than any museum in the country. The Performing Arts Center has second only to the Lincoln Center in terms of the number of seats and theaters. Go down the list. The Botanic Gardens, the most frequently visited gardens in North America. That was an investment back then. Then you get into fast tracks in 2003, 119 miles of new track for transit all around the metro area was a regional tax.
How come I still can't get to the airport, though?
January.
All
January
right.
of 2016. You wise guy. But we did have, if you go back and look at metropolitan, and this was a tax increase. There was 0.4% sales tax on the ballot in 2003. We had 34 mayors in the metropolitan area. 2/3 were Republicans. Every one of them unanimously supported that tax increase.
All right.
Show me where that happens.
Thank you. A slightly tougher question. After Aurora, you passed some gun control laws, but you couldn't get very far. It keeps happening. Just happened in my home state of Louisiana. Theater shootings, people with guns who shouldn't have it. Should we have better common sense gun laws nationwide, and how do we get there?
Well, I think that, and we continue to work on improving this and on a state-by-state basis, unfortunately. And I think many in this group have heard me talk about universal background checks. I look at, and we got into the big battle back in 2013, and we finally went back, all my more conservative friends, and the elected officials, almost every Republican I knew who wasn't in government thought that universal background checks made a lot of sense. But my more conservative elected friends said, well, crooks aren't stupid. They're not going to get a background check. Well, so we went back and looked in 2012 and just got the data. We'd gotten to half the gun purchases. Did we catch anyone? And I think I can still remember the stats. 38 people convicted of homicide tried to buy a gun in 2012, and we stopped them. There were 133 people convicted of sexual assault. There were 1,400 people convicted of robbery. There were 820 people who had outstanding, or 620 people, I am getting a little rusty, of outstanding judicial restraining orders. And just in case you don't think crooks are that stupid, 420 people, when they came to pick up their gun, we arrested them for an outstanding warrant for a violent crime.
Yeah. If they were smart, Governor Nixon, you wanted to get in on that. I'm sorry.
I'm confident that a national debate on guns will continue. It's not hugely relevant in show-me state. We always assume everyone is armed, and I'm generally relatively accurate in that assertion. But the point I wanted to make is that after the horrific matters that these two great American leaders had to deal with at Aurora and at Newtown, we took a little different approach in our state. We focused directly on the mental health needs. So one of the things we did was put 31 mental health liaisons to be direct liaisons between cops and the mental health system throughout the state of Missouri. In the first year that there was somebody for a cop to call and a way for somebody to get service, those 31 people had 12,000 calls from police, and we made 7,500 referrals for mental health services. Okay?
Bravo. Thank you. That's important.
I mean, it's really we should not miss the disengagement and the inability to agree on gun laws as an excuse not to move forward on significant mental health issues that exist and are clear.
I'm going to open it up in a moment, but I have one last question for Governor Hickenlooper. I mean, it's a serious question. I actually warned him on this. But you've been a supporter of Hillary Clinton. I think you just went to a fundraiser when you were back east and you happened to donate. But there's a possibility, whatever it may be, that she becomes far less viable as a candidate. We see it. What is your thought process about whether or not you would get in if she became less viable as a candidate?
What do you mean recovering journalist? So first, when I did see Hillary a couple of weeks ago. She spoke to about 60 people at a fundraiser in New Hampshire. I happened to be incidentally in that same place. And I will tell you, she was so focused, and she touched every point. She talked 35 minutes without any notes and was very, very impressive. Again, you're going to see $1 billion worth of attack ads against her, but I don't see her not being viable. And at the end, I watched the people in the audience, and no one looked at their cell phone, no one looked away. And at the end of that period, I sat there and said, I'm not sure there's anyone on the Republican side who's as ready on day one to take that job and do it as well as she is. And I'm not trying to dodge the question. I love Governor. I'm not looking for any other jobs. If she decided to pull herself out and something happened, I mean, look at these. We have no shortage of Democrats that would be, I think, excellent presidential candidates, and I probably think we'd all look at it.
And is it...
So you're a recovering journalist. I'm a recovering elected official.
Let anybody else jump in, saying they wanted to announce their candidacy. No, it's an interesting way to frame it. And the other issue that you and I have talked about, too, is the role of a vice president. What would you see the interesting role if she were to ask you? How would you do that thought process? I could ask anybody else here, but your name has come up most often, probably, I think, because she doesn't have to worry about the other states on this dais.
Well, it certainly usually comes up in the context of how important Colorado is going to be in this election.
Correct.
I have no illusions about why. Originally, I thought it was just because the name Hickenlooper was so musical.
No.
But
it's because Colorado is a swing state. We'll
I
grant you
understand that. Again, I think any one of us, if offered a chance to have a significant role, right, and not just to be another pretty face, just kidding, but to have a significant role in trying to direct the domestic policy, international policy of this country, which is clearly the leader of how the world is evolving, it would be something you'd have to take very seriously.
Let me open it up, please. Yes, Stephen Edlis. He doesn't need a mic.
I want to circle back to the very first first subject you talked about, which was infrastructure.
Infrastructure.
Cash crunch on the other side. Number one, how did building highways become controversial? Number two, where did President Eisenhower get the money
Yeah.
to build all our great highways?
We started talking in my office about the last time we had a great consensus was when President Eisenhower explained to us everything from highways to going to having a space program to building what became the internet. What happened, and how do we get that back?
There's a couple things going on. Number one, people are being told that they can have everything and they don't have to pay for it. And that's become part of our national politics. And it actually, it even relates to your question about the economic divide. Listen, I want the wealthy to get wealthier. It's okay with me. But I don't want the poor to get poorer, and I want the middle class to grow. And at some point, we have to stop playing this game that you can have the best trained police officers and not pay for them, and you can have great teachers and not support them, and you can have great cities and not invest in them, and you can have a great transportation system and not pay for it. And so listen, tolls and a gas tax were the two primary ways to do it. We haven't raised tax, even though the income on the gas tax is going down precipitously, which causes this gigantic
Because oil
problem.
prices are going down?
Yeah, because we're driving further on a gallon of gas is the biggest reason, right? I mean, and the vehicles are cleaner, thank God. But we.
Was a gas tax that supported it?
Yeah.
I mean, the question of when did it become controversial? 6 years ago, 8 years ago, right? We've had 33 extensions on a highway bill, but it's not just a highway bill. We can't figure out at the federal level how to fund forest fighting and forest management. We can't figure out when we actually shut down our federal government over disputes. I mean, this is so much bigger that dysfunction and inability to get things through Washington, D.C. is frankly so much bigger than just the highway bill, but that's emblematic because it impacts us all. But you can almost talk about any of the major bills right now, any of the major issues confronting us. And that's one of the reasons why, from my perspective, it's exciting to be a governor, because we have to get things done. A heck of a lot isn't getting done a lot in Congress right now, from my perspective.
I think one of the problems, and I'll be very, very straight here. People care how their money gets spent. When I was elected governor, I took over in January 2009. First day I was in office, I trimmed government by 800 employees and cut $200 million out of the budget. Since I've been governor, we have 5,000 fewer employees at the state of Missouri, the highest credit rating in the country, have cut taxes 4 times, and just redid a bond issue. 5,000 fewer employees. During the height of the recession in Washington, D.C., not a single person lost their job. Not a single person downsized anything. No one is talking in Washington about making government better. They're talking about making government bigger. And until we have a conversation in this country about delivering the services of this state and this country in a cost-effective way, and have the guts and courage to say you can do it with fewer people, and quit, they don't have credibility. The problem is, certainly political people make excuses, and taxes are always hard, and it's never easy to run for office and say, my job is to ask you to take your wallet out and give me more money. But when you ask people to give more money for the same darn thing, Americans are pretty smart. We got to make this thing run better. And if you do that in our state, and we're setting up to try to do a transportation program, we have closed 2 district offices. We have 1,039 fewer employees at Missouri Department of Transportation, rolled out slowly. We've expanded design build. We've moved forward some bonding capacity. And next year, I think we have a very good chance to get the people in Missouri, since we have done those things, to be willing to seriously consider to give us more money, because they know we'll spend it more efficiently and effectively we would have done if we just went around with a tin cup, ask them for a little bit more money.
Questions over there? Anybody? Way back. Trying to get every section in. Trying to give our interns the exercise they need running mics.
Thank you. Governor Hickenlooper, I grew up in Denver, and I just want to thank you for being a really effective governor, I think. Are any of you attracted to the idea of a basic income guarantee for all American citizens? And if so, what do you see as the greatest challenge of implementing such a system?
I'll take a shot at that. By income guarantee, do you mean just a blank amount of money they get every year? Well, I mean, there's another thing to talk about, a job guarantee, right? That if you're willing to go out and work, we make sure that there's going to be something you can do there that's useful, some sort of national service. I don't think an income guarantee is, it would never fly, and B, I don't think it's constructive. I think our biggest challenge, and I think each of us would say some variation of this, we are in a global jobs war right now, and we have to compete with other parts of the world like we never have and make sure we do a better job of training our young people and even our people my age who've lost their job, the industry is gone, making sure we retrain people. But part of this is making sure that the jobs that are created in these years to come are created in our states or is created in our country. And that, I think, the focus is to get people to work harder at that and work harder at trying to create businesses. One thing I would support is lowering the barriers and making it much easier for people to start businesses and have a whole ton more startups.
Over on this side, anybody? Way back. The people in the back are winning. Yeah. It's important to get here early to get a seat near the back.
This is for the governor of Missouri.
And could you intro yourself?
I'm Donna Slade, and my daughter just graduated from WashU Architecture in May. She went to a lot of the Ferguson protests that were peaceful and wonderful. She thought your guys did a great job. She was so disappointed in the press. Is there a way you would manage the press on Ferguson differently if you had to do it over? And can you? I don't even know.
Yeah. No. I mean, real. There's a difference between local press and national press. There's a difference between print and TV. But if I was going to focus on TV, it would be that we should work really hard if a false narrative gets started. For example, if one person started a false narrative, I'll go personal about it. Somebody started a false narrative about me that I had not been there or wasn't involved. The shooting was a Sunday. On Monday morning at 9 a.m., I was on the phone with the chief of police and the county executive. Later that afternoon, I was on the phone with the Attorney General of the United States. On Tuesday evening, I was at a town meeting there. Before I went there, I went by the shooting site. And by Wednesday, I was preparing to declare a state of emergency because I thought that there was too much militarization in the response initially that was going to cause a flashback. I don't consider that being absent. And if I would have had time when somebody was standing up on there and putting a Nixon big head up or whatever and screaming at me, maybe I should have played a little whack-a-mole with that. But in our line of work, the press has a very difficult job to do. They don't have many resources. But I do think there is a fundamental difference between the TV folks who are kind of filming a movie for the evening, shall we say, and the print folks who try to get a little closer to right. So I'd probably, the other thing to do different about the press is to try to, in some fashion, reward with information some of the more responsible members instead of just blanket treating them, and then worry about press mechanics a little bit more. When you're in the middle of riots, it's really hard to get good visuals. It's good to control the setting that you're talking, and you're working with folks. So I think a little bit of that. But once again, my golly, all of that attention is getting action. And 2 years from now, when nobody's talking about this anymore, there's going to be more kids in school, more preschool, more summer jobs, better relationships with the cops, and things will move forward. So they are moving forward, slowly, but they are.
Bill Nitza?
Governor, this is a collective question. It's about public employee pension funding shortfalls. I think everybody will agree this is a big problem. I think everybody will agree that assuming a 7.6% rate of return on pension funds is space cadet stuff. And furthermore, I hope everybody would agree that the old benefits for votes routine, which has been all too prevalent, needs to change.
Which one of you wants to take that one?
Wait.
Well, you have to get to a question, Bill.
All right, if you were the governor of Illinois, which none of you are, what would you propose to your legislature?
All right, go ahead. Dan? I'm sorry.
I don't know enough. I mean, obviously, I followed the Chicago case and the state case, and it turns on a constitutional question in that state, which is somewhat unique to that state. And so I don't think you can use Illinois as the comparison.
Yeah, but Bill has a good question.
The general question I think is fair. The average pension in my state being collected by about 40,000 people, if I remember correctly, general numbers, is about $34,000. That's it. $34,000. Now, there are people who get pensions much higher than that, but when you take all those highs and you take all the lows, it's about $34,000.
And the Connecticut pension plan is fully...
When I became governor, I mean, one of the reasons I didn't expect to win election is that in my first 4 years of office, I took all the big issues that I could take on, I took on, and we structured our relationship with our state employees. By the way, we've done better than 7.6% on average since I've been governor. I just want to point that out to you. But having said that, we changed the relationship we have had with our employees. You know, the most beneficial change we made on the pension side was in Connecticut. People frequently retired 3 years early because you only paid a penalty of 3% of your long-term benefit per year. So if somebody's going to give you a lot of money or some amount of money for 3 years and it's only going to cost you 9% the rest of your life, it's not a bad deal. So people routinely retired 3 years early. We doubled it. It's 6%. It's a terrible deal. 18% is a lot of money, and even 6% for 1 year is a lot of money. When I became governor, the only employees who contributed to OPEB, other post-employment benefits, were people who were hired after 2009. That was me. I got elected in 2010, and so now everybody contributes to the account. You look at those couple of changes and some others in a negotiated deal, which was rejected by a vote the first time, and I told them what I was going to do, and they voted a second time, and they approved it that time, saved somewhere between $21 and $22 billion.
Governor Bullock, yep.
Yeah, I guess I'd only add, we all run for office for something, right? And we're excited about it. It's not necessarily, I want to go out and fix that pension system. But by the same token, immediately when I came into office, our pension system wasn't actuarially sound, a lot of problems. Same Republican legislature, I said, if we want businesses to come here, if we want basically to have that basic economic foundation going forward, I don't want to be New Jersey with 8 credit downgradings the last 5 years. Number one thing that we'll do with that first legislative session is fix our pension system. And we did it by everybody giving a little bit, but we didn't do it all on the backs of our public servants as well. J.P. Morgan last year said Montana's the most fiscally prudent state in the country. In part, it's because of taking those efforts of bringing folks together and saying, let's get this off the table, then we can go forward and focus on all the good things that we want to.
In the way back, or semi-way back, waving your hand and standing up. I can't see that far back because of the lights. And then we'll do a couple
Herbert
more.
Rosenfeld is my name. And I have a question, whoever wishes to take this one. You haven't focused on the young insurrection that's taken place, 25 to 40 years old mainly, or younger, because they have an inability to have a future or to get an education. My question is this: what do you do in your state to support or develop carpenters, electricians, plumbers, masons, those people that get paid very well, and those that go to college unnecessarily and learn English lit or Shakespeare? What would you do to develop community
Which one
college?
of you wants to? Governor Hickenlooper.
I wish I had the right Shakespeare quote right on the top of my head. As an English major, undergraduate, went back to get the master's in geology later, but an English major. I think every one of us, and again, we are working on this very hard. Actually, I don't know if Zoe Barrett is here, Aspen resident, but she's runs the Markle Foundation, and they are our partners right now trying to put together a transferable, stackable set of working with LinkedIn so that certificates and badges and other ways of learning specific skills can be accumulated in a person's lifetime, and employers can see exactly what someone's learned, who they've learned it from, who's given them a badge, that this gets integrated with our community colleges and our universities, our high schools, so kids can be in the workplace learning how to be a welder or in an insurance company, wherever, that this, it's more of a European model. And I think you're exactly right. We have to move towards that. Having kids come out of school with this huge debt and literally no way of realistically paying it off, and without 10 or 20 years, it's a disgrace.
Governor Nixon.
Let me talk about one sector of the organized union workforce, the building trades. I think it's an important discussion to have. It is the sector of unions that have spent more money on training than any other sector. They build their own training sites. The building trades have more educational institutions to teach people how to do sheet metal, iron workers, welding, in their own, paid for by themselves, and the contractors they work with. It's much larger than California, all of the universities in California, okay? So those are, the union folks in the building trades have done a wonderful job at putting an infrastructure together. And those that attack unions, especially in the building trades, make a serious mistake, because these are literally workers that have taken a piece of their paycheck to help train their brothers and sisters and have set up that same system that Governor Hickenlooper talks about as you work your way up from a starting carpenter to a full-fledged carpenter all the way up to a working wage. So I would think it's important to, in that sector, recognize that union private sector help that has made a big difference. So you can argue about unions in other places and all that, but it's very important. The second part, worker training, important. I up here crowing my conservative credentials on dollars. That first year when I cut all that money and 5,000 fewer employees, we upped our dollars for customized training for workers by 52% the same year. You got to invest in people. And you got to make sure that they have the skills to compete anywhere.
I'm going to just give one shout out to Colorado Mountain College, a whole system of colleges here that has really helped move skills to the workforce. Yes, sir, right there. And then, yeah.
Governor Hickenlooper, thanks for being here. And I just wanted to ask you, there is, including Denver, there are several counties as well that do not honor ICE detainers, or not all ICE detainers. And is that something that you can commit to changing going forward with the rest of your term?
And explain the question.
Yeah, right. Maybe you should explain the question, because I don't want to put words in his mouth. Are you talking about when people are arrested and brought into custody and they don't have proper identification?
Right, when you realize that the Immigration and Customs Enforcement
Right.
already has a detainer out for that person.
Yeah.
Well, I think that, so the way it's set up is that ICE has 48 hours to come and take that person if there's someone that has committed a crime, someone that is a high enough priority that they want to take them into custody. The state cannot go in and tell the city of Denver or the city of Boulder or any of these places how their police force has to operate or how their jail operates. That being said, the vast majority, certainly when I was at Denver, when someone is detained and we send the information over and there is a detainer, they generally come over and get them. Now, the problems occur when they get too busy and all of a sudden you're holding someone for literally week after week after week, and they don't always reimburse those local communities for all that jail time. People ask, well, why don't every time police officer stops someone who doesn't have a valid identification, why don't we lock them up? Well, we wouldn't have room in the jails, and no citizen would be willing to pay the bills for that. So that's why there's this prioritization, in most cases, there are exceptions, and sometimes those are certainly what happened in California is there's no one that's not going to want to respond and make sure that doesn't happen in their community. Right. But it's got to be a partnership between the federal government and the local community.
Two last questions here. And then I'm going to go over here.
Hi, governors. Thank you for being here today. And Walter, thank you for doing always a great job. My question is about health care. And I'd like to know, my father would always say, if you're healthy, you're wealthy. So I'd like to know how the Affordable Health Care Act is doing in each of your states, and is it making people healthier?
A couple of you lean forward. Who would, Governor Malloy?
We had a very successful implementation and exceeded all of our goals and multiples of what the federal goal was year one for us. And it is making a difference. I mean, we talk about mental health. Well, we have a whole bunch of people who have access to some level of mental health services that didn't have it before. And the percentage of children in our school system under any circumstances is tiny. And that has a gigantic impact on the ability of that child who would otherwise be denied some medical or dental service having access to that service. And so, yeah, from preschool through old age, it's making a difference. And I think, that I'll share a discussion of, you had some Republican governors here who have not extended ACA or Medicaid specifically. You should have seen those guys in a private discussion with the president, telling the president that he had to solve this issue on the private insurance side through state exchanges versus federal exchanges because they were afraid that the Supreme Court decision would go the wrong way, and all of a sudden they were going to be blamed. Now, they didn't say that publicly. They didn't leave the White House and go out and make a point that the president had to do that, and they were urging the president to do that. They just wanted the problem to go away. It was maybe one of the more interesting discussions I've observed at the White House, how a bunch of people will say one thing on outside the building and will say something completely different inside the building.
By the way, that goes back a long time in history. There's wonderful old stories of, I'm going to tell the president, and then you bring them on in and they all cable.
They wanted to be safe.
Yeah.
So, and I'll just real quickly say, I think Colorado is healthier for having expanded Medicaid. The scalability is going to allow us to begin to control costs. But you go back 25 or 30 years and look at the arc of what America is paying for health care. And I support expanding health care to everyone. I believe health care should be a right, not a privilege. But that being said, everybody in this room, everybody in this country is going to have to really focus on how do we control costs. Quality is not going to go down. We would never allow it to get worse, right? So we've got to improve quality, but we've got to control costs. If you look at what's going to happen to our transportation system, our higher education, our K-12, slowly but surely, our health care is taking resources from state governments away from those very important uses.
Last question, Joni.
Somewhat related to the last question. In 1965-67, the Community Mental Health Act was passed. They closed the state hospitals, the mental hospitals, and people became quite homeless because lots of the states didn't have community health with mental health. With or without Obamacare, are you able to put the dots together where you can save money because mental health worked with the police back in the 70s, giving them support for their PTSD. They went on home visits for domestic violence. They worked with the schools. Are you able to enact that with or without Obamacare, and do you see it as saving money in the long run?
Go ahead. Governor Nixon, yeah.
Well, I mean, we have not moved forward on Medicaid. I wish we would have. It would cover 50,000 people with mental illness challenges. That has not stopped us from moving forward dramatically on a number of mental health issues. I think one of the biggest shifts in this country has been to the least restrictive environment for people with mental challenges and to move them out into community placement. Literally millions of people that were locked up have been unlocked, and making sure they're matched with services is a huge, huge challenge every day in our jobs, in local communities' jobs, in families' jobs, in families' responsibilities, and families' difficult choices. We're a long way from the finish line. We're a long way for two reasons. Number one, resources, but number two, on the social science side, one of the most underreported areas is how much progress we're making in diagnosing and treating all sorts of mental challenges. We are making huge strides, but we don't have the services on the other side to meet the needs that are out there.
Governor Malloy?
The point I would make on this subject, and it relates to general health care and then mental health. Most mental health in my state is supplied by community providers or not-for-profit agencies. That's just the reality. And by not managing appropriately the health side, the health cost side, what we actually saw, and I've gone back and looked at it in my state, we saw dramatic increases year after year after year of the delivery of what we would call medical health services. And as a result, the agencies that serve 500,000 of my residents who are not-for-profit or community provider types saw no increase, while hospitals received more than $1 billion more in the same period of time. And so we needed to make some progress in the ACA and other steps so that we can actually start to make sure that we control those costs so that we can spend money where you and I agree that we need to spend more money. Final thought on this, it's not just money. I lived through Newtown, the Sandy Hook school shooting. That young man had all the access he could possibly have wanted and could have afforded it. Part of this is we've got to find ways to wrap around families better and tighter to make them healthier overall and to be able to approach this subject. But solving the medical side, the personal health side, is in the long term a way that we can make a lot of progress on the mental health side.
Thank you very much. Let me end on a personal note, which is over the course of the summer, we have a lot of people here. Many of them have 4 stars on their shoulder or have been senators or people who've run a variety of things or academics and ideas. Perhaps along with the military people, it's the governors who are the most impressive because they actually get things done instead of being divisive. Thank you all for being here.